I am heavy
bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
This is Andrew Whitstead, and you are listening to Heavy Bored. And we're recording this on June 15th, 2024. My guest today is the author and physician David Weill. David is the former director of the Center for Advanced Lung and Heart-Lung Transplant Program at Stanford University Medical Center, a practicing pulmonologist, a public speaker, a researcher, an educator, and also a chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board for the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association. Also a board member of several nonprofits, including the Board of Governors of Tulane Medical School, among others, listeners. And David has testified before the United States Senate twice, listeners. Once before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and once before the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He's a scientist, an advocate, a family man, and currently, David is the principal of the Weill Consulting Group, a firm centered around improving pulmonary, ICU, and transplant care for patients. And on top of all that, listeners, David is also a writer. Fiction, nonfiction, memoir. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Newsweek, and many, many more. And his first book, a memoir titled Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant, published in 2021, follows the ins and outs, ups and downs of working with transplant patients, waiting for organs and the like. And David's latest book, All That Really Matters, was published just this week on June 11th from Rare Bird, and is available wherever books are sold, listeners, as well as linked in the description of this episode. All That Really Matters is David's debut novel, a medical drama centered around the high stakes, high stress, and big money world of transplant physicians. Following Joe Bosco, a hotshot transplant surgeon relishing the rewards that come from being at the top of his field. That is, until his life starts to unravel. And David isn't afraid to show the emotional and physical toll being a top surgeon takes on those who pursue it, particularly when it's matters of life and death. David's writing style is direct, clean, no thrills, the type of literary style you can't help but admire. And not what many expect when they learn that this is his debut novel, with many more to come, I'm sure. But David's many talents make him a Renaissance man of sorts, something we love on this podcast, but more importantly, something that has a long tradition in literature and art. Authors and artists using their many experiences and talents to bring a new work of art into existence. David Weill is one of those writers, listeners, and he works in the vein of those physicians that have come before and contributed to the literature of the world. And I am thrilled to have David Weill bring his flavor of writing, reading, and medical expertise to all of you listeners out there. David, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Andrew, thank you for having me and for that kind introduction. I'm a little embarrassed by all of it, but thank you.
David, when I first contacted you and I was doing this and coming up with that introduction, I was like, wow, this guy is the most accomplished man I think we've ever had on this podcast. So you deserve that introduction, David. Absolutely.
Thank you. It's kind of you. Really is.
And I like to start this off. You get kind of what I call the heavy board treatment, where there's obviously lots of questions that we ask writers, and writers get asked this all the time, but then we have a little we go into some specifics for this podcast too. But I always like to start this off, and this is a multi-part questions. Bear with me, we'll bang them down one at a time. But I like to start. What was your childhood like? How did you grow up? And to kind of gear that towards something, how did that lead you to writing and reading? Was it always something you did? Did you come to it later in life? And then for you specifically, on top of that, when did medicine come into your life? Was that always a career goal from a young age?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, my childhood was fantastic. I was so fortunate in many ways. I was raised by a physician and a nurse, and so medicine was kind of a family business. I started working in the hospitals when I was 15. I always wanted to be a doctor. I was around medicine a lot. My parents' friends were physicians and nurses. I never really wavered from that. The love of reading also was given to me by my mother. She's somebody that, to this day, at age 88, reads 75 to 100 books a year. And she would pass them on. And she and I had our own private book club together most of our lives, which I'll cherish forever. And so I really credit her with interesting me in reading. And I think quite naturally, like a lot of avid readers, I said, maybe I'll give it a try. And as my career went on, I just saw so much that in the hospital setting that I wanted to write about. I'm not going to write exclusively about medicine or healthcare for the rest of my career, but I certainly wanted to write these first two books set in a medical situation. And, I walked around the hospital a lot by myself, especially in the afternoons and evenings. And I wish somebody could be there with me to see what I saw. And I tried to put that down on the page and bring the reader in.
Absolutely. And you grew up in New Orleans, you said?
I did. Yeah, I grew up there.
The Big Easy. Yeah. It's actually, I didn't include this in the introduction, although I thought about it. I don't keep not always keep my personal life out of the podcast, but I had my father was a physician. Is retired now, and my mother was also a nurse. So I had a very similar kind of, when you're raised in that environment. I didn't go into medicine, obviously, but it is just kind of when you're raised around that. You're raised around all the people. You go to the friends that are also usually in medicine, and you're kind of always, you're sitting down for dinner at the table, and your parents are talking about a patient. They're, not violating any, HIPAA or anything, but they're just saying, wow, the patient died today, or this patient, was had a blood clot during something, and you're just these high stakes stories that are just become dinner table conversation almost, and it does kind of, it's I guess what I'm getting at, kind of a richness of life kind of factor to growing up around medicine, and then in your case participating and being quite successful in it too. So yeah, we have a young David Weill growing up in New Orleans, experiencing all of this. And I always like to ask next, like, what were some of the first writers you were enamored with, or who are your kind of go-to inspirations or idols in the literary kind of side of things?
Yeah, I started out actually reading a lot of Southern writers and New Orleans writers in particular. Walker Percy, for instance, I'm a huge fan of. Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, Willie Morris from Mississippi, Faulkner, just to name a few. A lot of Southern writers. I was very interested in New Orleans writers, still am, actually. Sorry about that.
No worries. No, we love dogs chiming in. Yeah, mine does it all the time. Yeah.
And then as time went on, and I became more and more interested in medicine, I also started reading works by physicians, just so I could experience what they were experiencing. And clearly I wanted to know what the life was like because I was going to enter it. And so a lot of these physician writers really became my inspiration, and they still are. And I think that, one thing that's happened after COVID is you see more and more medical professionals turning to the page. And I think that's a great development. I truly do.
Yeah. I had this for a little bit later, but you wrote a piece about this in LitHub a few years ago, I believe, where you talked about why medicine needs storytellers. And what do you mean by that in terms of why does medicine need these types of storytellers?
Well, I think that there are two broad categories that we can entertain. I think my memoir, for instance, nonfiction, other physician works of nonfiction, tell the story, tell the truth, stick to the facts. There's books about healthcare policy, what's wrong with healthcare, and obviously plenty. Um, I think those books are useful. I really do. But I wanted to turn to fiction because I think it gave me a lot more latitude to explore some of the themes that, quite frankly, I couldn't in my memoir for all sorts of different reasons. One is I wasn't eager to offend either the institutions that I worked at or my colleagues, and I didn't want to actually tell every single little thing that happened, the good and the bad. Whereas in fiction, I had all kind of latitude. I had a blast exploring everything that interests me about healthcare, the personal interactions, the devastating losses, the trauma that it inflicts upon we who provide it. What happens to those folks when it becomes too much? And as they've said about fiction, I didn't make this up. It's a pack of lies that tells the truth. And I feel like I was able to do that in this second book. And so it was quite liberating, I think.
Yeah, it's always the line between the kind of the truth and fiction and kind of using both. It's a fantastic tool, especially to exploit. Yeah, if you have NDAs or something too, you don't want to be putting anybody on blast. That's always a constant thing in literature too, particularly for memoirists. I think when you're, how much is your right to put, not that you're putting people on blast or putting them, in an unkind light, but yeah, how much authority do you have as a writer to take, a story of your brothers and sisters or your parents or your friends and colleagues and put that out to the world? It is kind of a responsibility you have to consider and kind of weigh, and then fiction allows you to just do anything, like you have ultimate, and you don't do this, you don't go super or anything like kind of fantasy or sci-fi, but it is this, you could even go that far if you wanted, like medical experimentations and these kind of, gets me to this other question where I have to ask, and we've covered some of these writers on this podcast before, Michael Crichton, Robin Cook, these kind of writers that, these kind of physician doctors / writers, any inspiration there? Are you a fan of those writers? These guys, I guess they kind of took on the image in the late 20th century as like the doctor author,
Yeah. Yeah, I am. I'm a fan of Michael Crichton and Robin Cook. I don't. This work of fiction is different, I think, from theirs. It's not so much, a thriller, where it's more of a drama than a thriller, I think. I'll leave it to the readers to figure that out.
It is, yeah, you're right.
And Robin Cook, it was always sort of like, a dead body got lost somewhere, or, something like that. It's not, what I'm interested in exploring in fiction is not so much that. What I was interested in, and my novel demonstrates this, is all these things actually happen in hospitals in my book. I mean, there's none of it that is like sci-fi that was invented out of thin air. I either saw this stuff happen, I saw these characters in action in part in one person or another. So it really wasn't very difficult, for me to imagine these circumstances because they actually happen. And if they didn't happen directly in the hospitals I work in right now, they happened in the ones that I consult with. And so, it's slightly different, I think, than what Michael Crichton and Robin Cook have done, although I respect both of them immensely. They were sort of, I think, a little bit more out there, maybe off of reality a little bit.
Yeah, they were not trying to capture deep emotional drama, although there's plenty of that in the books and in their stories, sure. But yeah, much more sci-fi oriented listeners than what you get with David's book here. It's much more kind of even literary kind of aspiring, where there's kind of the deep emotional kind of dramatic moments in your book that really kind of do separate you from somebody like Crichton or Cook. But I have to ask about this too, and I'm excited to talk to you about this and your thoughts on it. The kind of the intersection between medicine and literature and the way they seem to constantly be intersecting throughout history. Science and literature is, medicine being a branch of science, and I think Crichton, Cook, But even going further back, like one of my favorite poets, William Carlos Williams, he was a doctor by day, right? Poet by night. And he's not one of the only ones. You know, there were many, I'm thinking Whitman was not a doctor, but he was kind of worked in nursing during the Civil War. Even Hemingway has, we're stretching a little bit, but kind of association with kind of the healthcare setting from his kind of background and all that. And I'm just curious of your thoughts, the kind of, why do you think the two are so often intersected the way that they are, this kind of medicine and literature?
I think to me, it's fairly simple. I think it's the emotion it provokes. I think practicing medicine, especially the kind of medicine I practice, which was transplantation, where the stakes are really high, the intensity is high, there are life and death situations every day. I think it evokes that emotion, and I think writers need that in order to turn to the page and write something meaningful. I think it's very difficult to write in a sterile environment about sterile things. It's very hard. One of the reasons that I love living in New Orleans, for instance, is that I think it evokes that kind of emotion. And I think medicine really brings out these really profound human experiences that lend itself well to storytelling. And I think we can also let the lay public see what's right and wrong in medicine in a more effective way with storytelling than we can with, say, a PowerPoint presentation or a 15-point plan to fix healthcare. That stuff is not particularly accessible to most of the general public.
And I'm thinking now, like I'm wondering about the intersection why they constantly intersect this kind of hope, right? This kind of literature, even if it's like a fantasy book or something, some poems, it kind of evokes that kind of hopefulness, that kind of that, I don't want to say the word tender, but it often is, right? This kind of tenderness in healthcare, like, somebody's life in your hands. And that kind of that same emotional spot, that kind of responsibility you feel kind of lends itself to literature in a lot of ways, especially if you're seeing patients by day and then going home and doing some writing, on a fiction or nonfiction project. It almost kind of, that human experience is just unparalleled. Like you really can't get that kind of, I'm sure you can, there's other professions that you can get that kind of experience when, but medicine, surgery, this kind of seeing patients that are, looking to you as a source of hope and stuff, like really, I don't know. I've been fascinated by this for years, obviously my background and my father being a doctor and all of that. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that kind of the hope that kind of comes through in those?
Well, Exhale, my first book, came out of journal entries. And by journal entries, I mean bullet point journal entries, not real writing. But it was a way for me in the evenings after I would come home from the hospital for me to sum up what happened, and I think that, I talked to a lot of young physicians, medical students even, and they asked me about how you cope with this, topsy-turvy field. And I tell them, for me, I had my coping mechanisms, but one was scribbling in my journal about what just happened and how did I feel about it more than just what happened. And I think that that's really key. And I advise anybody in healthcare or any other high stress situation to try to do that.
Yeah. It really, and I think it's something many listeners out there and many others probably don't think about either when they're a doctor, doctor, you go to your doctor or in any setting and they give you a prescription or they give you a diagnosis, run tests, but then like they don't often think of the side of you have to deliver bad news, terminal news, that and then to the effect that has on the psyche, like how that and how you handle that. It could easily, and you've talked about this in many other interviews and things about burnout and stuff within the profession. And I guess it's just a rich vein to tap for for literature, for creativity, for exploring that deep emotional. And I think this is what you were getting at in your piece, right? Why medicine needs storytellers, this kind of to tell those stories. Because I think unless you are a doctor, unless you're in this field, you really aren't aware of that kind of emotional toll that you're kind of carrying every day when you go to work, especially in something like transplants.
Yeah, I think that's all true, Andrew. I think when my first book came out, I got a lot of messages from doctors, patients, even patients of mine that I cared for. And, I think most patients think of their doctors kind of as robots, I think. They come in to the room, they start firing off medical questions. They don't seem to be impacted one way or the other by what's happening with the patients in front of them. And after I wrote my first book, and I think the same thing's going to happen with the second book. I think people are going to say, "Wow, these people are human. I didn't know." And I actually think that we should, as healthcare workers, let our patients know that we're human a lot more. I think my generation of doctors were told not to show your emotions in medical school. Move on to the next patient. Keep it keep an emotional distance from what's happening to the patient. I don't think that's very good advice. I think that what we've got to do, I think, is let our patients know that we care about them, and sometimes that involves showing emotion.
And
And yeah, and I think and I'll finish on this.
no,
I think we also have to talk to one another as healthcare workers about what's going on inside our own head. I mean, when was at my most difficult periods in my career, I largely kept it to myself, and that's not good. I think that we have to be able to feel safe in telling one of our colleagues that we're struggling for whatever reason. It's usually because we're having compassion fatigue or empathy depletion, or however you want to phrase it. I think we have to be able to talk to one another about it. And one silver lining to COVID has been a recognition that we really do need to share these experiences with our colleagues. That's one positive that came from a very awful experience.
and this is a theme I think in both your books too. The kind of the healthcare professional, the doctor wanting to help people, bumping up against the kind of Medicaid, Medicare, kind of the bureaucratic apparatus that how you get paid. I remember my father constantly complaining about this kind of thing. They set the pay scale, they set how much time you're allowed to kind of spend with a patient, and it really makes you feel like you said almost like a robot. Even if you're kind of interacting, you see the human side of it, and then you have to go fill out the paperwork and then you're like, oh my, am I a robot? Like, am I, like, the way that they're treating
Yeah.
me about this? It's
It, and I think that's getting worse. I wish I could say otherwise. And I think the electronic health record has not helped that. Most of us that go see a physician, we look at the back of the head of somebody typing into a computer. And we call the computer the eye patient because it really, the computer becomes the patient. And that's very concerning to me. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the healthcare ecosystem is very difficult for the people that practice it. And I'm afraid there's really not a clear fix in sight to that. It's a big business. It's becoming more of a business. And we really have put profit over purpose in medicine. And it's changed, it changed a lot from when I first, started out. It concerns me. I wish I had a solution to it. I don't. It's such it's a 20% of our whole economy,
right.
and it's very difficult to just sort of change courses in something that is so ingrained, in our profit machine.
There were many dinner table conversations. I said, really, in the last 10 years or so, with my father, complaining about MedStar and their kind of consolidation of all the hospitals in the country, and
Right.
their kind of strong arming. He kind of was an independent contractor with the hospital, and then they were strong arming all the contractors, about pay, strong arming the nurses. They didn't want to pay the nurses, they were too expensive. This kind of the business side kind of getting into the way of the human side. And I love that both your books capture this. You don't shy away from writing about this. And then you said there's not an easy answer to this. We don't have a solution on the table, but it just, that also makes it rich for drama, for fiction, for even the memoir, right? For the honesty, that kind of human interaction. But I wanted to ask you this too. What made you shift toward writing after a very successful career in transplant? Uh, what drove you toward it?
A passion. It's actually very similar. I compare it a lot to my first career, which was transplant. I loved everything about it. I still do. Never had trouble getting out of bed going to work. Never had a moment where I was bored. I thought it was a waste of time. Never had a moment of that. So, in the second career, it's actually much the same. It reminds me a lot of the early days of my first career. I've been writing now seriously for 6 or 7 years, and it reminds me of the same stage when I was becoming a transplant doctor. Learning, trying to get better at it, working hard at it, because I think that's what writing is. I don't think it's somebody has the talent or they don't. I think it's a lot of perspiration.
Oh, yeah.
And it reminds me quite a lot of when I was early in my transplant career. And I hope, because I'm just that kind of person, I just hope to get better at it. That's all. I just want to improve. And it's so hard to do that I think it's going to be a lifelong challenge. I think it'll carry me for the rest of my days.
Absolutely. And going off that, you once said in an interview that the transplant doctors are control enthusiasts by nature. And as a bit of a control freak myself, which I think is a good quality in a writer, being perfectly honest, but I have to ask, why is that? And why does that tendency to control these kind of many little bits of chaos around us translate so well to writing and, being working in transplant like you have?
Yeah, I think in my transplant career, control meant safety. And, I wanted the perfect operation and the perfect patient outcome and the perfect transplant program, and that would drive me and some of the people around me a little bit crazy, because it's an inherently imperfect field. I think writing is much the same way. It's very difficult to get it absolutely right all the time, whether you're writing a piece or long form like a book or even sending an email. I care what my emails look like. I think it's really interesting as a writer to go back and look at what you write periodically. There's sentences and paragraphs in Exhale that I don't love. And now that this book is out and I worked on it for 3 years, I probably read it and rewrote it thousands of times, and there's sentences in there that I don't love. And that's the nature of it. But that was the nature of transplant too. Our team did a lot of good, but there were some mistakes that we made, and I try not to focus only on those. But it's the same with writing. It's so hard to do that I think I've heard even very accomplished authors say they can't even look at their first book or their second book, that it nauseates them, makes them physically ill. And I didn't relate to that when I first heard that. I do now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that constant improvement, and that I think I love that. I love the kind of control, not a control freak, but yeah, you said control almost equals safety. And I think it's the same thing for writing. Like, this attempt to at least do it is gaining some safety over it. And I think I get it from my father, who was a surgeon. He very much a control, wanted to hit that control. You get everything right and you minimize risk by trying to take more control. And the same for writing. I love that translates to this kind of artistic expression, especially with the fiction writing, and then also like a practical kind of life-saving application. Like, they kind of intertwine. And it's going to keep coming up because I'm obsessed with this idea of medicine and literature intersecting, but I think that's another reason that they do, is that this kind of, at that humanity level, that's just, it's hard to find another career that really does do that. I mean, I guess there are plenty of them, there's teachers and scientists and stuff that have, but yeah, just really fascinated by that.
These are, these fields, writers, I have an immense respect for writers. I did before I started writing, just because I was just amazed at the books that I read. And I think it's so hard. I just think it's difficult no matter who you are, how you try to do it. It's just hard to write, and, I'm working on my next project now, and I'm reminded again, because I'm drafting it. Now I'm in that stage where I'm actually, I have de novo words rather than revising. And I just, you remember how difficult it is to get those words down, and I don't know why that is. I'm sure a neuroscientist could tell me why that is, but it just is. So.
And this leads me to the question too about, I like to ask writers this, and what was the process like for you writing something like this, All That Matters or All That Really Matters, and your memoir, Exhale, how did it affect you? Because I think, like most writing, I assume it takes something from you, and that could be small, that could be large, that could be a huge emotional toll or something. It could even be something that, manifests more in your life. At the very least, it takes some energy out of you. Like what was the process like for you putting this stuff down in your memoir and in your debut novel here, All That Really Matters?
I think you're right. I think, writers live inside their own head. They have to develop an inner life, or they contemplative life, or they can't do it. I've never encountered a writer who could write that didn't have wasn't in touch with their own inner self, because it requires that. Now, does it result in you being in your own head a little more than probably is comfortable to other people? Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think writers are a special group. If you've ever been around a bunch of them, you can spot them a mile away. They're usually off staring into space somewhere and thinking. And I think that's the process. I remember Danny Shapiro, an author who I got the pleasure of working with on my first book, talking about, that somebody wanted to do an internship with her. And she found that hilarious, because this person would be presumably sitting there watching her stare off into space and write for half an hour, and then get up and go to the kitchen and get coffee, and then come back, and then let the FedEx guy in, to get it's just it really is an amazingly solitary experience while you're doing it. And then the book comes out, and then I'm talking with folks like you, and I'm out there talking about the book, and then people are telling me what they think of the book, and it becomes very public at that point. But while you're writing it, it's just you.
How is that? How is that dealing with the publicity where people take what they want from the work? Once you put the book out there, people take what they want out of it. How is it when you're kind of confronted with something that maybe, I don't know, they didn't get what you wanted, or that maybe they're reading into a certain aspect of it too much? How do you deal with that? Or...
Well, I think after working on a book for 3 years, and that's not an unreasonable amount of time to produce a novel, I don't think. But I think, you the author, think the book is about X, and that's what you think it's about. And then somebody reads it and they say, well, it's actually about Y. And so, the book's only been out 4 or 5 days, right. And people have already read it, and they're starting to tell me what they think of it. And I'm starting to figure out, what do people really think the book is about? And that interests me, because I spent 3 years of my life trying to write it. And so they're telling me what the book's about. And I think that fascinates me. I mean, that's the fun part of this process, is to figure out how your words are being interpreted.
Absolutely. Is there any biographical elements to this book, All That Really Matters? Obviously, some of the transplant stuff is you have experience with, but I think, like, as a writer, it is something that often happens, even if we don't know, like, consciously thinking it, like, our life, our experiences kind of come out into the characters, a little bit. It makes them more real, it makes them more human and all that. But I just, particularly, I'm curious, kind of, one aspect of the novel, Joe leaving the academic side of medicine. Was there any biographical stuff to that, or any elements of Joe as a character? And if so, why? Why is that?
Well, I think that all novelists are informed by their real life experiences. I'm no exception to that. Yes, there's parallels between Joe Bosco and David Weill. I'm a transplant doctor, so was he. He liked to ride bikes, so do I. He spent time in New Orleans, so did I. I think it pretty much stops there. I think that there's going to be the natural question: is this guy really you? I like to think of myself as a better guy than this guy, but maybe I'm not. That's for everybody else to figure out. You know, I think the one thing I enjoyed about writing fiction is you do get to imagine if your life had turned right instead of left. And yes, there's instances where I saw some of this stuff in the hospital and it could have played out differently. No, I didn't get into the sort of mess that Joe got into ever. But you never know, right? What can happen? And I think that that's where the creativity comes in, quite a bit. So I really like that part. But I mean, somebody was asking me in another interview about, is this like John Grisham, who's an attorney writing, and John Grisham has said in interviews, yeah, I mean, a basis on the experiences I had practicing law. I don't think it's terribly different than that, although John Grisham, I'm sure, would cringe if I compared myself to him. But I don't think it's terribly different from that, and I don't think I'd be the first novelist to ever do that.
Absolutely, and it's because I covered Robin Cook so recently. I covered Chromosome 6 with some friends on this podcast that I was. There were a lot of stuff in his books, and I think Crichton does this, and a lot of the other medical kind of writers do this, where there are some shots at the academic side of it. And somebody like myself who is just recently kind of failed out of academia and this kind of, because when you are in a situation where you're trying to do something, particularly like medicine, where you're trying to do something good and you're trying to help people in this way, just like with the the MedStar stuff, where you're bumping up against the kind of business side of it, and you're kind of bumping up against this kind of the restrictions in the academic and the business world of it. You're not allowed to just be a good doctor almost. Like it prevents you from doing maybe all that you could or all that you would like to do in the field. And I was just curious about stuff like that, as again mainly from my own experience, and it's a brutal world out there. But you were successful in the academic side of this with
my academic career was fine, just fine. I think it was interesting in this book just to his father. The character's father was the ultimate academician, dean of Harvard Medical School, president of Tulane, Nobel Prize laureate. It doesn't get any better than that. And so I think the tension between academic life and, a private practice physician, I wanted to set up between father and son, and that interests me. And just as, I wrote about in the book, hospital administrators. Those are their favorite targets of doctors and nurses, for that matter, in hospitals. Now, I've worked with a lot of hospital administrators. Some are great people. They care about the same things I care about. They're fantastic. And some are bloody awful. And so, that's the world, right? And I wanted to set up, my character liked to buck the conventional wisdom and like to buck the system. And so the hospital administrators in my book were not particularly sympathetic characters.
Absolutely. And I think it gives it to kind of a realism to the fiction too, because you're using those experiences, said all kinds of them, good and bad. And then it really does add to the output, the creative endeavor. It really does make it, I keep using the word rich, like a very rich topic to explore for all these different ways you could explore it, in all these, in the many books to come, I'm sure. But I wanted to ask you this, which is another thing I'm kind of constantly thinking about or going over in kind of my literary oriented head. What is it about doctors in fiction and stuff? Like what draws us to characters that are doctors, or, maybe like the authority of a doctor or a scientist in a work of fiction? Why do you think they make for such good characters and even subjects for writing?
Here's my take on it. Take it for what it's worth.
Oh yeah.
Uh, I think, the physicians I worked with, my main experience with them was brilliant, committed, flawed. That was my experience. I would include, well, not the brilliant part, committed and flawed. I would describe myself that way. I think that these are people that deal with life and death circumstances that have to really commit to their field. They started becoming academically successful at a young age. They've been told all their life that they're a star. And if folks don't think that that affects the way they look at themselves in the mirror, then I have a story to tell you. And so I think that that's why perhaps these physicians end up being rich characters. And I've always been interested in the fact that a lot of folks like to watch medically oriented TV. When I was a kid, it was MASH. You're probably too young to remember that. MASH and St. Elsewhere and ER and Grey's Anatomy and all of that, because there's these people walking around doing stuff that is life and death and high stress and all of that, and they're trying to be normal human beings. Right. Well, the two aren't always compatible. And that's what I try to show in the books, that, these folks get told, and I was victim of this too. You get told how wonderful you are by a lot. And, that clouds your judgment. It just does.
Absolutely.
I didn't see many doctors that were unaffected by all of that. Didn't see that.
I know my father always tells this story where when he's retired now, but he was a surgeon for 35 years, and he was training surgeons, he was training young guys, in their residency and their fellowships and stuff. He said he would give them Clint Eastwood quotes, where he would say, "A man has to know his limitations, right? Before you start a surgery, what are your limitations?" He's like, and then ask yourself, do you feel lucky? Do you feel lucky today?
Yeah.
Because you're about to go into it. You're about to be cutting into somebody, and you're about to, can you handle this? Can you do all that?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting, as my career went on, when I first started doing transplant work, I walked around mostly terrified, and as time went on, I got less terrified. But I also, up until the last transplant patient I ever took care of, it was an adrenaline rush. I never lost the wow of it. Right. It never went away. If I was practicing today, I think it would still be there. It amazed me in the early 90s when I started, and it amazes me now. And that's the wonder of it. That's why it's a beautiful thing.
And I think for fiction, especially, I'm thinking of all the great kind of, fictional doctors throughout literature, Van Helsing and stuff in Dracula, and these kind of these doctors that, because they're experts on their field, right? And they're kind of, so most, the average person has no idea what's going on inside of them, how to even, deal or function with a transplant or something like that, let alone the drugs and medicines and stuff. And then they turn to a doctor and they say, well, the doctor is the expert on this. And this is the authority that, and it just kind of, it's a good tool in fiction because it creates an authority figure to be like, well, this is the answer or something. But then I think what you're doing too is that you make it so human. It was like, yes, I'm an expert, but I'm still a human in this factor too. And that I could be wrong. I could be misdiagnosed, and I do my best to not, but then there's always this kind of, I think you're really good at capturing that kind of new tension in medicine, and this kind of, the doctor isn't necessarily the authority at all the time I guess in terms of the drama and then medicine, they're two different things, but it just kind of, using it as a tool in the writing is just something that I'm fascinated with. And I think your writing especially is a little different in terms of how you really show the authority figure of a doctor. You know, I'm using that very loosely, the authority figure of a doctor, like this, the internal struggle that they feel as well, having that position, like you said, affecting the kind of the psyche, being told, oh, you're saving lives, you're a miracle worker, but then you're like, well, I'm just a guy that cares and, has dedicated my life to studying this stuff. And, yeah, I really admire that about your work, David.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, one of the things that I did, I think I did it really in both books, is I used these little italics when the character, either me in the first book or Joe Bosco in the second book, was thinking something, because I wanted the reader to know what somebody like that would be thinking while it's happened simultaneously. Because I remember when I was, working in the hospital, I had these thoughts that I didn't say out loud. And, it's interesting. I think it gives the reader insight into what's passing through somebody's mind while they're doing this kind of work.
Yeah, definitely. And it humanizes too, to this kind of, yeah. And another theme I wanted to touch on, you touch on this in both books too, the kind of the facing death theme. And I think with transplants, obviously this is a huge thing, but something I wanted to ask you about. I imagine there's a lot of that in the world of organ transplants and all of that, but also I think in writing good drama, like why do you think this kind of theme of facing death makes it so important or compelling when you're writing, even in fiction or in, transplant medicine?
Well, I think the stakes are high, in our field, and I think folks are attracted to high stakes literature. Whether it's a fighter pilot, Wall Street trader, something where, big issues. I bring up Grisham again. There was big things that were at play. I think that's a big, part of it. I also think, though, that, in doing this kind of work, I saw so much, and I think that, the material is kind of unending. I mean, there's just plenty of it out there, but I think it gets back to, if nothing is at stake, who wants to read it, right? But I think in at least the books that I try to write, including the next one, I want to be able to say, look, something's at stake here, something's at play. It could go right or it could go left. And hopefully people will want to keep turning the pages to find out what happens. And, I think that's when I read a book, that's what I'm interested in. What are the stakes for this character, whether it's fiction or nonfiction? And how is this all going to work out in the end? And I think healthcare in general is rich because there's not only the life and death, which is enough, but there's also, the system is so difficult to navigate. It's not just you and the patient in the hospital. I wish it was, but it's not. And there's societal forces at play. And I don't think I'm ever going to write something where those forces aren't commented upon. It would be, you're leaving a big part out if you just leave all of that to the side. Because I don't know anybody working in healthcare right now that's not acutely aware of this system, which isn't really a system at all. How it's impacting them directly. If you get a bunch of doctors and nurses together, it used to be in my father's generation, they traded patient stories one after another. Doctors don't do that as much anymore. They talk about the difficulties of working in the environment, and that saddens me.
Yeah, and it's weird how it changes with the time too. So as technology changes, it makes more advances, but then it also makes for more kind of clutter sometimes when you're like you said, kind of electronic records and all of that kind of causing problems. But this like the facing death, I think, yeah, it taps into the universal. So everybody is kind of dealing with that. So it taps into that easily, and then it heightens the tension and drama. And I just think people, or many readers, they're fascinated when they come across somebody who was practicing and faced with that on a day-to-day basis, like literally facing that. And you do this in your first book, and you do this in the second book as well, and All That Really Matters, where there's scenes where you have to tell somebody that we don't have the organ, we don't have it, you have this much time to live, essentially. And I think it is everybody's worst nightmare in some sense, right? Nobody wants to hear that, but then being the person that has to say that to somebody and do it, with the bedside manner, and do it with the kind of proper empathy, and also, like you said, it's almost impossible to not be attached to it, to not have some type of emotional, I don't want to say damage, but just kind of hit from doing that. And yeah, and then the famous scenes you mentioned, ER and stuff, people blowing up on the doctors in the waiting room or something because they have to inform them of, like, they can't. There's nothing they can do. Everybody thinks about it in that way, but I think the way you capture it with that, like the kind of the doctor's perspective, telling people this news, this kind of horrible news, that it's I don't know. I guess it's just kind of a refreshing way to look at this universal that's in a bunch of literature and a bunch of books.
Yeah, I think, death is on the mind of a lot of people. I mean, it's obviously this big unknown experience. I think most people, well, I say this without any data, but that doesn't stop me from saying it. I think most people are afraid of death, at least, my experience, both professionally and non-professionally. I think they don't know what happens, and, that's a conversation for another day. But I think when that's in the balance, that's always going to be something that everybody can relate to. And you're right. I mean, I wrote about this in Exhale. I mean, when I, would tell people that we couldn't find an organ and that meant they were going to die, those little chips, the little cracks, are what, got me out of the hospital. I, as a younger person, seemingly could handle it a little bit better than I could as an older physician. And there's, I think, a couple different reasons for that. But, we start practicing medicine when we're 30, we're fully trained at that point, more or less. And you can't expect to be the same person in your 50s as you were when you were 30, at least you hope not. And you react to these things quite differently. And that was my experience.
Yeah, well, I wonder. It's more of a personal question. Was when you're a family man, was having a family, did that change your perspective on?
Big time. So to me, there were two events in my life that changed me as a physician. Two personal events. One was having my two daughters. When my wife and I had kids, I changed, like a lot of people do.
Right.
And now I was also taking care of other people's kids and other people's daughters and sons and all of that. And it affected me differently. I mean, I think having kids makes you more vulnerable emotionally. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And then the second was fairly early in my career. My father got a liver transplant. And, that changed me, because here I was in that field, and he needed a liver transplant, and I helped take care of him after his liver transplant. And suddenly I saw, the patient's perspective more clearly. I saw the family member's perspective more clearly. I cared about my patients even more deeply than I did in the past, because, that's somebody's father that we were transplanting, or somebody's mom. And so those two big life events changed me as a person, quite apart from just getting older. And I think, I was probably typical of somebody, a young doctor, felt invulnerable. I tended toward the cocky, and, I didn't understand life's emotions, I think, like I understand them now. So things happen to people along the way. That's why it's always interested me about medicine, that you kind of choose your specialty when you're in your late 20s, and you expect that to carry you through the rest of your life. I don't know how that ever works, but I guess it does.
Yeah, and this is just a topic that's perennial kind of theme on the podcast, the kind of the aging and gaining experience, and how you take from that experience to enrich writing and fiction, even if you're doing fiction or nonfiction or any of that, it's invaluable. I always tell listeners, a lot of aspiring writers that listen to this, and it's the reason that so many writers, all these great writers that we hold up throughout history, most of them didn't even get a big break until they were in their 40s. It's like, well, why is that? It's like, well, because they had to spend years gaining experience, practicing, writing these things over and over again until you got to a point where you had that experience, you had this kind of many different connections to the topic at hand, and it shows in the writing too.
Yeah, I'm always amazed that there's people that write books, some of them really good, when they're 25 or 30. Right. I don't know how that works. My books, if I had written a book when I was 25, 30, 35, maybe even 40, would have been bloody awful. I mean, just terrible. And so I think it does require much more self-awareness than I would have suspected when I first started writing. I thought you just wrote, but you really have to reveal yourself on the page, and that's something that for me only happened with age. It would not have happened when I was younger.
Hey, would you believe there's still an extra hour of conversation left? Well, there is. And if you want to hear the full, uncensored episode, you need to subscribe at patreon.com/heavyboard, where you will receive full, uncensored episodes like this without any interruptions, ads, or anything else. And that's for subscribers only at patreon.com/heavyboard. So, what are you waiting for? Subscribe today and join the conversation.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored,
Some activities are intentional, right?
it shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.